Hello, divers, and welcome to
Mysteries of the Deep.
I'm Tom Feeney, podcaster and purveyor of pop culture propaganda, searching beneath the surface of what seems to be the ordinary, the mundane, the pedestrian. This week, we dive into a topic that has an impact on all of us, not just Americans, but everyone living on this big blue marble. I'm talking about censorship. Now don't worry, this will not be some sober, long-winded dissertation on freedom of speech or freedom of expression. Well, maybe a little. Mostly, it's a look at how, even in a country like the United States of America, whose fundamental principles are grounded in personal freedoms, can employ censorship based on even the slightest of perceived infractions. In other words, we're looking at movies that, at least in part, were banned in the U.S.A. Throughout U.S. history, there have been numerous instances of efforts to censor content, often viewed as violation of the First Amendment's free speech protections. The First Amendment is frequently cited by anti-censorship advocates, but its interpretation has varied, leading to many Supreme Court cases to attempt to define its protections. One significant legislation was the Comstock Act of 1873, which criminalized the mailing of obscene materials through the U.S. Postal Service. Nearly a century later, in 1957, the Supreme Court's Roth v. United States decision ruled that obscenity was not protected by the First Amendment and introduced the Roth test to determine obscenity based on community standards and the material's appeal to prurient interests. However, applying the Roth test proved challenging. Justice Potter Stewart's 1964 comment, "I know it when I see it," highlighted the difficulty in defining obscenity, which is not protected, as opposed to pornography, which is. The Motion Picture Production Code, or Hays Code, was introduced in the 1930s to censor the film industry, setting moral guidelines for film content from 1930 to 1968. Will Hays, former Postmaster General and President of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, was recruited to help restore Hollywood's image following several tawdry scandals. The code banned content such as explicit passion, perversion, adultery, and indecent dancing. Now, by the 1950s, the code's influence began to wane due to the rise of television, foreign films, and boundary-pushing directors, leading to its replacement by the MPAA film rating system in 1968.
Symbols. We're all familiar with them. There are shortcuts to vital information. That's why, to familiarize you with the movie rating symbols which will be used by this theater, we present the following guide for parents and young people. It is designed to inform parents about the suitability of movie content for viewing by their children. G, all ages admitted, general audiences. GP, all ages admitted, parental guidance suggested. R, restricted, under 17 requires accompanying parent or adult guardian. X, no one under 18 admitted.
Part of that new system was the infamous X rating. First stamped on the 1969 drama Midnight Cowboy starring Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight, the X rating meant the kiss of death for any mainstream film that received that brand. To this day, Midnight Cowboy remains the only X-rated film to win Best Picture at the Academy Awards. And the dreaded X was quickly appropriated by the adult film industry. Fun fact, the X rating was never trademarked by the Motion Picture Association of America, so producers did not have to submit their films for review in order to slap their movies with an X. Now, 20 years later, the MPAA tried to correct this error by introducing the definitely trademarked NC-17 rating, which pretty much meant the same as the X. No one under 17 admitted. It didn't change anything. Theaters still refused to run NC-17 movies, and newspapers and TV stations refused to run ads for them. Now, after the rating system was established, the banning of movies in America was typically the purview of state and local censorship boards. One such film was John Waters' 1972 gross-out cult classic, Pink Flamingos. Now, I won't go into detail what transpires in Pink Flamingos, but if you know, you know. Now, the film was banned in many places, not just in the U.S., but around the world. But that was then. Since its initial release, Pink Flamingos has been accepted into the National Film Registry as a movie of cultural importance. Be that as it may, Pink Flamingos is still technically banned in one town in one state in the United States of America: Hicksville, New York, on Long Island. To this day, director Waters says he will not drive through Hicksville, just in case. Obscenity is not the only grounds on which films can be deemed worthy of censorship. Perhaps the most common reasons are based on religious beliefs. In 1988, the legendary Martin Scorsese made a film based on a 1955 novel that itself was banned by the Catholic Church. It depicts Jesus of Nazareth being tempted by Satan to disavow his intended fate, take Mary Magdalene for his wife, and live the rest of his life as a normal man.
Martin Scorsese brings us a startling vision. An extraordinary story.
Mother, Magdalene, where are you?
The last temptation of Christ.
Mother, I'm sorry for being a bad son.
The Last Temptation of Christ was, to no one's surprise, barreling like a runaway locomotive towards a concrete wall of controversy. For observers at the time who were waiting for a total train wreck, they certainly got one.
Where do you stand on The Last Temptation of Christ?
These protesters, most of whom have not seen the movie, leave no doubt where they stand. They think this portrait of Christ as more mortal man than divinity should be burned unseen. To that end, many of you have seen this flyer. A Christian organization called Master Media has sent these out by the millions nationwide. Among other things, it calls for a boycott of theaters this weekend showing the picture.
God's world is big enough for everybody.
Nazarene, that's against the law.
Then the law is against my heart.
Meanwhile, this image of Christ may be unfamiliar to those of us who have grown up with the Hollywood version. Jesus with blue eyes, trimmed beard, and King James English accent. This interpretation is different, but is it more real or just another kind of showbiz hype?
The protest created a market for the film where there probably wasn't one before.
Meanwhile, I have learned that the film will open this weekend in these 6 markets, but it may be 2 more weeks before a decision is made about it playing in Kansas City. For KCTV5, I'm John Tibbetts.
Leading the protest against the movie was the American Family Association and Campus Crusade for Christ. They called for a boycott, resulting in some theater chains refusing to screen the film. Bill Bright, the founder of the CCC, even offered to purchase all copies of the movie in order to destroy them. In response, Universal Studios published an open letter in newspapers nationwide, asserting that it would not yield to these protests and compromise Americans' First Amendment rights to view the film. The end of that open letter perhaps said it best. In the United States, no one sect or coalition has the power to set boundaries around each person's freedom to explore religious and philosophical questions, whether through speech, books, or film. These freedoms protect all of us. They are precious. They are not for sale. Despite this, the cities of Savannah, Georgia, New Orleans, Louisiana, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and Santa Ana, California successfully enforced bans on the movie, and the rental chain Blockbuster, RIP, chose not to carry it. The film, released in August of 1988, opened to long lines at the ticket booth, sold-out theaters, and sign-carrying protesters. In the end, The Last Temptation of Christ did make a profit. That's Profit. Finally, we have a case where the federal government effectively banned, of all things, a Canadian documentary. In 1982, the U.S. Department of Justice mandated that the American distributors of the Canadian short film If You Love This Planet register as foreign agents and label the film as political propaganda. The film, featuring an Australian anti-nuclear activist and clips of then-President Ronald Reagan, faced restricted distribution because of this designation. The distributors sued, arguing that the label constituted censorship and violated their free speech rights. However, they lost in the Supreme Court case Meese versus Keene. Now, in fact, the documentary was so controversial that even the monolithic Canadian Broadcasting Corporation would not run it. Despite these setbacks, the film went on to win an Oscar for Best Documentary Short in 1983. In this day and age, most of the banned content, whether it be movies, books, or music, is censored by local public school districts. In 2023, a Florida school banned a Disney movie about racial integration after a parent complained that students should not see scenes of hatred towards a 6-year-old black girl. The parent objected to her child watching the 1998 movie Ruby Bridges. The film depicts the true story of one of the first black students to attend Louisiana public schools in 1960. Historical photos showing the white mobs hurling insults and threats at the girl have been used in history lessons for decades, highlighting the resistance of white communities to school integration in the Jim Crow South. The Florida parent, Emily Conklin, argued that the movie is inappropriate for second-grade students, formally complaining that the racial slurs and scenes of white people threatening 6-year-old Ruby might teach white students to hate black people. Now, according to Disney's website, the movie is unrated. Disney describes the film as showing how Bridges is subjected to the true ugliness of racism for the very first time when she integrates her New Orleans school. The real Ruby Bridges, now in her late 60s, is a civil rights activist, children's book author, and speaker. Sadly, this is not an isolated case. In fact, the banning of books and movies across parts of the United States seems to be growing at an alarming rate. In fact, a 2023 study showed that the banning of materials in U.S. public schools increased by 33% over 2022. Almost half of those cases were reported in, and brace yourself for a real shocker, Florida. The bright side to this? Students are pushing back against this censorship. One such protest happened recently in Oregon.
Students at Canby High School are protesting the removal of 37 books from school libraries.
The whole point of education is to learn and grow through knowledge, and I'm worried that we're not going to get that chance if we just sit back and let it happen.
Holding signs that say educate, not indoctrinate, and book banning is fear and ignorance on their lunch break.
We are a small town. It's something that's happening here. It's not only just affecting us, but if we can make a statement and make a stand against this and try and combat it, then that's really important to me.
The school district decided to remove the books instead of leaving them on the shelves until a committee finishes a review. 2 community members filed to have the books removed due to sexual content, violence, and other subjects. Some school board members have shared concerns about explicit content in books over the last few months. A Canby School District spokeswoman declined our request for an interview. In a statement, she said, "Because of the volume of requests, Canby will hold the books out of circulation until they can be reviewed this summer." The list of removed books includes a popular fantasy series, books about sexual assault and LGBTQ lifestyles, and award-winning novels that have been on the shelves for decades.
When the books aren't in the school that are representative of the school population, we're not banning our books to protect students. We're removing books to discriminate against them.
To many Americans, freedom of speech is our most precious right. The ability to voice your opinions, thoughts, and beliefs without fear of government reprisal is part of the very foundation of the United States. There are those who would police the things we see, hear, and read under the guise of protecting others. When it comes to children, the parents and/or guardians must make those choices. For adults, the choice should be theirs and theirs alone. Freedom of speech is, of course, not absolute here in the United States. However, the United States absolutely needs to protect freedom of speech. Thanks for listening. If this is the first time you've heard this podcast, check out our past episodes, available on almost all podcast providers, and subscribe so you don't miss a single one. If you like what you hear, write us a review. We would love to know what you think. Or you can drop us a line at thedepdivepodcast@gmail.com or on our Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter/X feeds. You can find links to those and our awesome t-shirt store in the bio of our Instagram page. All clips used in this podcast are meant for educational purposes only and not to infringe on existing copyrights. Mysteries of the Deep is part of the Deep Dive Podcast family and a production of Automaton Studios.